appropriate affirmative action programs, and we want to propose that we get rid of privileged women using this affirmative action. And so from our side, we'll bring you two major points as Prime Minister. I'll talk about how affirmative action creates resentment and how it is unfair when privileged women tend to use it, especially in the context of a third world country. So affirmative action causes resentment in the essence that it tends to benefit, especially when you look at privileged women who can, let's take an example of Zimbabwe, whereby we have privileged women who want to study law, right? So the policy of the affirmative action that has been put forward was that women who want to study law only need to have 13 points so that they can study law. But this becomes unfair when you look at it on the other side, whereby men who would want to study that same law, men who want to study that same law have to have 15 points. Right? So then in that context, it's unfair. But then on the other side, whereby privileged women in Zimbabwe don't have the same problems as women who are not in a position to get those 13 points. So the context in that is that privileged women don't have the same chores that unprivileged women have. In the unprivileged side, the women are subjected to do all the chores, all the work at home. They're the ones who do the cooking, do the dishes, sweep the houses, and they are subject to a lot of work. So then their pass rate is pretty low. So then they cannot study law or get that 13 points at times. Sometimes they get it, but they cannot get the opportunity because most women who are privileged tend to take the slots which are available in the country. So then we say that women who are privileged should not take these positions, but they should have an equal standing with the men and should attain 15 points that are required for men also, because they don't have the same problems. Taking 5, they don't have the same problems that are faced by underdeveloped women. For women in the who have are unprivileged. So then by doing so, we create a better way of pushing for women's rights, especially for those who have been discriminated in those areas. So then we talk about, okay.
Clarification.
Yeah.
How do you define a privileged background? Does the woman itself choose to be do they say if they're privileged, or is there some external actor?
All right, so there's an external actor in essence, because we say privileged in the sense that, especially if you look at third world countries, it's easy to really classify what a privileged woman would be like in essence. So privileged women in essence have a good background. It's not really a patriarchal background that makes the woman do what women are subjected to be in the country. In Africa, as an entirety, women are said to be the ones that do all the work, whilst the men don't do all the work. That's why the government at first pushed this policy whereby women only need to have 13 points. But then we've developed and moved on, and most areas, especially in urban areas, women don't do all the work. Most have maids, and men and women are doing the same work. So it's a bit balanced, and there's not that discrimination upon women. So then we say that those who have that privilege don't need to have don't need to push 13 points only, but need to push the metric so that they can allow for the slots which are available to do law for those who are not able to get into them because of their background, which is not really privileged in essence. So we are pushing that we create an equality in essence with how men and women are looked at between the merits of life in essence, and how we demarcate a privileged woman and non-privileged woman. As I explained, the one that's privileged doesn't have the same problems as the one that's not privileged, in the sense of that the one that's not privileged tends to not to be able to do well because of their background, and the one that's privileged has not much workload or problems if we measure the two. So then we go on to talk about how women who are privileged tend to take slots which are available for those that are not. This happens consistently even if you look at how scholarships are taken. One can take a scholarship, but then they can afford to pay the school fees, but then they're taking the slot for those that cannot. So then in essence, we are finishing the slots for those that cannot be able to pay for those things. So this creates a very bad and unfair world in essence when you have people that, yeah, let's take a break, yes.
If there is a non-privileged woman getting, like, for example, into the law studies? Won't that be an example for everyone who is against feminism and affirmative action to say, look, we just get like bad and incompetent women in these like jobs or study programs?
It's not like that. Because when you look at it in essence, when women are accepted for law because of having 13 points, they look at it as a policy that's not been changed for a while. But then women, most of them, aren't getting to that. So when you say that law student, it creates a bad image for them, it doesn't. But then we are saying that if they do not have the same problems as unprivileged women, they should not take that, that part of getting 13 points only. They should push to get 15 because they don't have the same problems that the poor or that the unprivileged are facing, that those who have a background that doesn't afford them to get in are facing. So what we've told you as government is that these affirmative action programs, which most privileged women take, is unfair and it creates resentment when you have someone who cannot attain a certain place because it has been taken from them by someone who can easily attain it, gets it. And when you look at how unfair it is for this system to be in existence in the current status quo. So with that, we beg to propose.
I'd like to thank that speaker very much for their speech. I'd like to invite the leader of the opposition to open case to the opposition. Hear, hear.
Three arguments from opening opposition in my speech. The first one will be that this will create a divide within women communities and female organizations. The second will be that we have a decrease of female role model on their side of the house. And the third one will be that we have a bad perception of the rest of society because of this action. But before that, I want to point out a couple of things in OG. 2 points of rebuttal in this case, or 2 points of clarification. The first one, as we asked how privilege is defined, they basically said, well, we have absolute criterion on which we want to define what privilege is. But they have never shown which criteria these might be. Might it be money, how wealthy these people are, or is it like the job of the parents, or is it the state of education, is it the university that these women are going to? We say that there is no absolute criteria for being privileged, especially in these contexts, and therefore we say this creates the absolute impression of privilege, that there is something like a clear divide between that, but we say there isn't. It might be that a person has high education, but still faces problems within society. Maybe under their definition, this will fall under being privileged, and therefore they should not get AA, while we say this might lead to problems because this person definitely needs those actions. We say every criteria they choose is insufficient because there are always fringe cases in which it would be necessary to have affirmative action, and therefore we can't have any possible objective definition for privilege in this context. And their main argument, or their only argument, was that basically if people are privileged, they face less to no struggles, and therefore they shouldn't get AA. We say they choose to talk primarily about developing countries. We say, especially in those countries, the people, like women, even if they are privileged or richer than the rest of society, still face big struggles. We can see that in most of the developing world. Like in India, many people who have rich parents enjoy high education and stuff like that. They still are facing oppression of their parents, oppression of the patriarchy. You can see that in India, most around Africa and South America. But we say even in the first world, this leads to problems because there are still even for privileged women, there are struggles within society that would be faced if there was no affirmative action to help them. To the first constructive point in my speech, we say this will lead to a divide within women communities and feminist organizations. Basically, what you're creating is a two-group divergence. You say the first group is the one who are privileged. They can manage on their own. They do not need affirmative action. The second one is like not good enough to be to manage on their own, and therefore you create something like a ranking, a divide between those two groups. For example, if you have a quota and some people can't apply for a women quota within a job, and some people can't apply for that quota because they're too privileged, this will probably lead to a perception of arrogance by the others, because they might, people who then have to take the quota because they can't manage on their own will probably have the perception that the others are so arrogant or so much better in any way that this will probably lead to a divide between those two groups. We say this is really problematic on 3 different levels of impact. The first is that we think women in general in the just public sphere will probably stand less together if it is necessary, because there's this artificial divide between the two groups, the one that can manage on their own, the others that can't. Secondly, within feminist organizations, it's basically the same idea. But here it's even more important that all women work together, or all people within the feminist organization. If you have now those groups, the group within the feminist organization that can manage on their own, that don't need affirmative action, and compared to that, the group that needs affirmative action, we say this constructs an artificial divide that will probably lead to less working together within this group, which is problematic. To the second point of my constructive, it decreases the existence of female role models. We say, especially quotas have been placed because we need more women within a system which still has patriarchal structures around the world. We say it's way more likely that a privileged woman will become, will get into that position due to the affirmative action quotas. This means, probably because of the circumstances they had, because of the education they enjoyed, because of the university they went to, but still, they are likely to get into a high-end position within a company or something like that, into a management position. On the comparative, if they aren't allowed to take that quota, it doesn't mean that a less privileged woman gets into the system. It just means that no woman gets into the system, because the less privileged women probably didn't enjoy these circumstances. Therefore, it's less likely that they will be able to get through the quota, and therefore, we say that there isn't, on their side of the house, and they're in the comparative, these women, or there aren't any women in these management positions. Therefore, we say this is very problematic because of the impact. The impact is that there will probably be less women in high positions within management companies or within the standard industries. Therefore, we say there are less role models for other women to look up to. This is problematic because now women who face struggles can't have anyone else to look up and say, well, these women have been, these women have done what I would like to do. They have become the management within this company. The third point I would like to touch on is the perception of the rest of society. The problem now that they're creating is that affirmative action is not a choice, not a necessity. They say, at the moment in the status quo, we say it's necessary for some, because there are inequalities that we would like to change, inequalities like to change, then and on their side of the house it will be perceived as a choice. If we say it has effect on other groups, it will always be the question then, when is a group privileged enough to need affirmative action? This has problems because it's harder to implement new affirmative actions, and it's harder to defend old affirmative actions that we definitely still want and need in our society.
I'd like to thank the leader of the opposition for their speech. I'd like for the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case of the proposition.
Okay, now, panel, what we are telling you as the government is that we believe that affirmative action is there to help those who are less privileged. That's the reason why all those have happened. The reason why we've said women affirmative action on women is because we found out that women generally, back in the time, is that women were the less privileged and they were noticed as the minorities. But what we are now saying is that now, because there are those who are really inferior, those who are really are less privileged and who are much more like the poor ones, we find that it doesn't become fair now for those women which are now privileged to attain or to get whatever the affirmative action is trying to put in to help out those who are much more less privileged in context, that is women. But first, before I go to my points, I shall rebut the main point which they came up with. Okay, now. They say that we need a criterion in which women are supposed to be labeled as if they are privileged or they are in the levels of privilege. But what you are telling you as the government is that any criteria can be used. And we can say that women can be labeled as privileged financially, they can be privileged as in their background, as in their home, in their abilities, whereby they do not have much work they will be doing at home. All those areas are privileged areas, and we cannot really start talking about them throughout this whole debate. But what you are telling you is that now it becomes problematic when now those women those women which are privileged come into the areas whereby the less privileged are. Now, they were talking about a matter whereby where education and works, there will be less women. But we're telling you that if we are to use this affirmative action to help more less privileged women, we'll find that more women will be in those offices which they say the women won't be. Therefore, we find that now the affirmative action is there to now help more less privileged women who are in the society than just trying to emphasize and put forth the pressure to say that every woman is supposed to get that affirmative action. How does this now have a problem? It does now have the problem that the privileged women are already able to get those positions because their ability in finance, their ability in home background, their ability in every single way is helping them to get the jobs that they want to get. But then what about that person who say that we need that 13 points for you to be able also to go to work? We find that those people now are the ones who are closed out, and we need those people also to be put in that zone whereby they have that privilege also to be part of their jobs. So that, as the government, we need that within our policy. I'll take you at 5 minutes. Now, what we want to tell you as in my point is that we're going to show you how the minority and the more inferior don't benefit more, as also it was part of my my rebuttal, how the ability of the privileged women is able to sustain themselves, and how backlash can affect when the privileged get the sponsorship, and also how dividing actually when the privileged women are getting more than the less privileged women. Now, I think I'll start with this one. Now, on the matter which they were saying that they will be dividing, women will be divided because there are others who do not get the affirmative action, and there are those who don't get them. Now, what you're telling you is that there will be actually a bigger divide and also a backlash also on my point, in the fact that when those who are able to afford and when those privileged are now getting what they need more or what they have already, it now causes a problem that those who are less privileged will have also a problem that how can you use this criterion to say that these people who are privileged are supposed to get the same as who are not privileged. Even in the general world, we find that it is better to help those who are less privileged than to help those who are more privileged. We find that becomes problematic, and it becomes unfair to those who do not afford. So at the end of the day, we as the government, we will find it as if I'm faithful, I said a 5. So we as the government, we find that it is really much unfair, and we need to make it much more fairer where the less privileged in larger numbers, and those less privileged can be helped than helping already those who are already privileged that are now reducing the numbers of the less privileged who can also become part of the world which we want as women to be empowered. Yes.
Looking at their proposal, which labels and defines women based on their socio-economic status, majority and minority, are only reducing the feminist struggle into socio-economic struggle and not struggles of women generally.
No, Pano, what we are telling you on this matter is that now, on their point of information, that what we really want is to ensure that those who are less privileged, those are the people who are our main center of attraction, who are the main people who we want to have that advantage also, which the privileged are already having. And we have clearly stated it within my example, that even in the general world, it is in faith that we are helping those people who are not who are already privileged. So but then, despite the fact that they are women or they are not women, in this case, although they are being stated as women, the privileged can be getting much more of an advantage than those who cannot afford, or those who are less advantaged, who are also disadvantaged. Now, on the ability to sustain themselves, we find that the people who are much more, the women who are much more able to sustain themselves and who are already sustained are the privileged one. And what we want also is that the privileged, the less privileged one, should also sustain themselves. In the African context, we find that now there is a higher number of less privileged women who are not able to sustain themselves because they cannot afford, or they cannot, or they do not have that ability now to be at the best as they could be. So you find at the end that it becomes problematic that if the ones who are able to sustain themselves come into the play and who are there to get also those 13 points and everything of that, so you find that those who are less privileged, who are not able to get whatever the result or the education that they want, will be put away or will be secluded, whereby those who are also privileged, who could also get those 15 points which men are also getting, and what we also are vouching for, to say that women should be empowered or should be the same as men, that will no longer be in the whole reason why affirmative action is there specifically for women. So we say that if we're to touch those women who are less privileged, we are bringing them also in that way, in that area whereby we are now helping them, and we are now putting them in the zone in which is required. So what have we told you in this debate? We've told you that the minority will be, and the less inferior will not benefit more than the ones who are much more privileged. And we also told you that the ability to sustain is much greater to the privileged than to the less privileged, and we intend to ensure that sustainability also happens to those who are less privileged. And also we've told you about the backlash and the dividing which will happen if it is to say that those who are able to afford gets same as those who are less able to afford. With this, we'll rest my case.
I would like to thank the last speaker for their speech, and I would like to thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to continue the case for the Opposition. Hear, hear.
It might be true that affirmative action for privileged women as opposed to for non-privileged women seems unfair at first sight. Yes, you might intuitively say unprivileged women deserve that in a way more than privileged women do. But even if that is true, we think that it is much more important to help women overall than to help single women, or to not be unfair to single women. We think that this policy is so harmful for women, like privileged and non-privileged women, for the feminist movement as a whole, that we should not consider it. A few more points of rebuttal. I first want to clarify why less privileged women will still not get jobs, etc., any kind of benefits that we're talking about. In many cases, these non-privileged women are simply not eligible to a certain benefit. For example, when we talk about studies, there are non-privileged women that simply do not have the A levels that are necessary to be allowed to study at a university. There are non-privileged women that, due to not being privileged, due to their bad socioeconomic background, simply do not have, for example, the job training that is needed to get a certain job. So you would simply not give this job to unprivileged women. At this point, the choice is give the job to a privileged woman or do not give it to any woman at all. We think that the role model that Marius already talked about is so important that you should still give it to privileged women. In addition to that, privileged women are still less privileged than most men are, so it's still fairer to give the job to a privileged woman than to a man. But even if there would be less privileged women who got the job or the study spot or whatever, we think that would be even worse, because then you would have like a less competent woman. That's not because she's a woman, that's just because she did not have the opportunities that a privileged woman has. But due to that, she is less competent, less qualified for the job, for the studies, etc., who is in the job and who is visible in that job or at the university. That would create a very, very bad image of affirmative action overall in society, because like opponents of affirmative action, opponents of feminism overall would say, look, you have this affirmative action thing and see what it leads to. You have a completely incompetent, unqualified person in that job that is just like an example of women are not able to fulfill this position. There are people who think like this, and this is incredibly harmful to women overall, because it creates an image of women in general not being competent. So we think that we should have the most competent women in these jobs, because we think that they are competent, it's possible for them to be competent and qualified for the job, but in many cases that is like privileged women. No, thank you. My first point. On an individual level, why would this policy be harmful to privileged women and to unprivileged women? I will start with privileged women. A privileged woman under this policy would not get the benefits from affirmative action. What this woman now has to think is, okay, I'm privileged, I do not get affirmative action. That is why I have the same opportunities as any man, which means I do simply not need affirmative action. That is what OG already said. These women do not need affirmative action. So it is natural that a woman would also think that. But still, this woman would not get the job. Why? This would make them feel worse than a man, because this woman thinks, okay, I had the same opportunities, but I'm just less qualified. I simply do not get this job because I'm worse. Although the truth is that still, even privileged women are so often discriminated against just because they are women. They are often they often do not get jobs because they might become pregnant because they're women. They are perceived as being less intelligent because men think that this woman is beautiful, so she can't be smart. These things are things that every woman faces, like privileged ones and non-privileged ones. Yes, other women might face even more struggles than that, but that does not mean that privileged women do not face discrimination at all. But still, this woman is made feel that it's due to her personal competencies that she does not get a job or that she does not get to study. And that is a problem, because that makes the woman feel less self-confidence, that makes women overall feel like that they are less competent than men in themselves, that they are worth less. And it is a problem because many women lack self-confidence. In many cases, it's just that women do not trust in themselves enough to apply for a certain job, for example. So making them feel even worse is an incredibly bad thing and harms these individual women and the society as a whole. Before I come to unprivileged women closing.
And on the point of competencies, do you completely ignore the improvement of the women who are underprivileged?
I don't really get what you mean, improving. Yes, I mean, I do not think that they would really improve when they get a job they're not qualified for, if that is what you were hinting at. If you're not, if people don't really care what you do in that job, you might slowly become better at doing that. But I think that people would watch this woman and okay, she's only there because she's a woman. We all know she's not as qualified as the man who might as well have gotten the job. Is she really doing the job well? So she's always under observance, and so no, I do not think that under this pressure the woman would really improve. Second thing, unprivileged women. If you have an unprivileged woman that now only gets a job because she's unprivileged, that will
point at her having an unprivileged background. To many women that just feels, or to many people in general, that just feels not good. You do not want to be told, okay, you have a non-privileged background because your parents are poorer than mine, because your parents did not have the opportunity to study, because you did not have the opportunity to go to school, whatever. You do not like being told that because it makes you feel in a society that focuses so much on performance, on having studied, on education, that makes you feel worthless. So it's also a bad thing for unprivileged women on the individual level. Last thing is that affirmative action will be perceived as an act of charity. It will not be perceived as something that is necessary to promote women, that does good for women, but it will be perceived as something, okay, there's someone who is in need, this woman does not get the job because she's not qualified enough, so yet let's just give it to her because we are so kind. Because we think that this policy undermines all that affirmative action is intended to achieve, we beg you to oppose.
Then I'm speaking for their speech, and I'd like to put the member of government to extend the case to the proposition. Hear, hear.
Honorable Chair and respected panels, look at me. I am a Bangladeshi. So is my teammate, right? But even after that, you see that there are facial differences between him and me. And the reason why is because I am not a Bengali. I am an indigenous woman back in the country. Yeah. My parents are, I was brought up in a family which is in the upper socioeconomic class, right? I had every privilege. I was brought up in the city. I was taught in English medium school. Yeah. Every privilege that the government gives never goes down to the girls who are in the Chittagong hill tracts. My parents signed up for every sort of privilege that the government gives out for the indigenous community in Bangladesh, right? So they never see that I am actually a woman who is more competent than other girls right out there, and I'm actually more competent just like the Bengali girls right out there. And no one sees that story. I can still go out and become the face of a struggling indigenous woman, something that I should never take the credit for. So what has been the clash in the upper house? We all acknowledge that there is a specific group of women who are underprivileged. What do you want to do to that? Opening government wants to do something. Opening up of opposition completely ignores the fact that something could be done. Do you treat them as potential people, or do you completely ignore the status quo, right? And that's something that they completely do, and this is what the main contention is about. I'm going to give some rebuttals and then move on to the extension, which is based on the stakeholders. First, the rebuttals. The opening opposition comes up and says, look, you know what? The glass ceiling is still going to exist. Yes, I do understand that glass ceiling still exists even when you go to Oxford, even when you go to the best institutions or best organizations. But understand that the struggle that I have is not similar to the struggle of a woman who is in the village, right? Yeah. A woman is struggling to have her education, basic education, to not get raped, to have justice because of being raped, to not get married. My struggle is probably breaking the glass ceiling, getting promotion, to becoming a manager. The struggles are not similar. But do understand, because I'm more competent than her, I can at least give up my privilege and still have an avenue to improve my status quo. That woman can't. No matter what happens, she still will be trapped in that vicious cycle of poverty, in that vicious cycle of the patriarchal society that imposed on us. I at least could do something, right? I could go out and reach to the help that's being provided by the legal law bodies. For example, my parents are trying to get me married off to someone else. I can go out, call the police and do something. That woman cannot. She doesn't even have a cell phone, right? So this is the sort of a privilege that I'm going to give up for her. Second, they come up and say, you know what, no more role models, blah, 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 blah. Understand what happens. In the feminist movement, right, you have a misconception that feminist women are like bitches, right? You do not like them. There are people who are privileged, still going to nag and complain about a lot of things. Understand what happens. We still have role models like Oprah. She was raped. We still have role models like Ellen DeGeneres, right? She was a gay. She had to struggle a lot. Still, it reaffirms the stance that women could still be strong despite the struggles, right? I understand that probably not all women are very rich, probably not all women are Kanye's girlfriend, but even after that, it reaffirms the stance that it helps to increase the conception that people have about the feminist movement. And it's very, very important, right? So what does the second speaker speaker come up and say, you know what, we're going to have less competency. They're completely excluding one particular population, which is underprivileged women. They do not ensure any way that they could break the cycle of the vicious cycle that they're going to be trained. You can get facilities. You can ensure more training for these incompetent women who are coming through these privileges. And that's very, very important, right? This will improve their confidence and all the sorts of impact that they're trying to show. Now coming to constructive, please sit down. Understand what happens when you talk about privilege. We do understand the opening government comes up and talks about privilege, right? But there's a new dimension. Privilege is more about birth lottery. It's any kind of lottery, right? For example, you are 18 and then you will win a lottery and your life changes. The sort of a narrative that sets for you when you have a privilege, that's your lottery that determines everything, is necessarily harmful, right? That's unfair. The sort of a narrative that in our status quo we show you is more beneficial for the entire feminist movement. We understand the problem that it never trickles down to the down of the pyramid. We tell you the goal here that we are trying to see is inclusion of the entire feminist movement. So what happens in the stakeholders? One, the privileged, second, the underprivileged, and third, the state or the organization that we're talking about. Understand what happens in the non-privileged people. These are the people to whom this facilities never trickles down, right? So they're always in the vicious cycle and they never get out. There's no mechanism that the opposition comes up and shows. This is very, very wrong. The moment you give them this privilege, they are more representation of this women. They could at least have an avenue where they could improve themselves. You could give them training. They have more inclusion and participation. You could do that through changing of your policies, right? Understand what happens in regional feminism. For example, the feminism in the West is not similar to the feminism in Asia or even in Middle East, right? So there are different struggles of women wide across the world. The moment you are talking about the problems faced by a white woman, is not similar to someone who is being forced to wear a burqa, right? So in that way, you can reduce the gap. The gap they're talking about is at least reduced in our status quo. In theirs, it doesn't, right? So it ultimately helps you to form to a uniformity in the feminist movement. Before that, opening. Any PR? Sorry, opening. Any PR?
Yes, like how does it help a woman who's struggling to be allowed to go to school by her parents because she's so unprivileged, to be like allowed to go to university due to AA because some privileged woman stepped down for her?
Oh, this is where we tell you. You can at least have that, give that privilege. You can at least change policies and train her and give everything that she needs to get into that particular university. And also, the one thing that they don't talk about with the privileged women, understand what privilege is, right? People take privilege for granted. They do not live up to the maximization of the potentials that's extremely important, right? For example, I am a privileged woman, right? I probably am studying in a university. But the moment I realize the depth of my privilege, by giving up a privilege, I realize what I had in the first place, right? I do not take it for granted. So when I do not take it for granted, I am maximizing my potential. This is going to benefit the entire feminist movement. The misconception of women being just nagging around despite having all the privileges they want is not going to be there. What does this increase? This increases empathy, right? For the privileged women to understand and realize and empathize with the underprivileged women, and also people outside the feminist movement understanding what feminist movement especially stands for. This increases fairness, right? This increases inclusion and no more backlash that we provide in the society. So what have we shown today? The upper house comes up and first they talk about whether this quota should the affirmative action should exist in the first place. We say it should, right? The sort of a class that they show, we have provided a better extension. We have shown you the impact. We have shown you how the three different stakeholders are incentivized, right? In that case, they just only show about the underprivileged women. They do not tell you about the impression or the mindset of the privileged women. These people come up and completely ignore everything that happens to these underprivileged women. They do not see the potential in them. In our worst case scenario, at least it trickles down to the underprivileged people. It at least goes out and incentivizes the entire feminist movement. In their best case scenario, nothing happens. Only a part of the movement could at least go ahead, but not the entire one. Thank you.
I'd like the speaker very much for their fine speech to call a member of opposition to extend the case of the opposition. Hear, hear.
Ladies and gentlemen, since this is not a policy debate, we don't think that the debate should be about whether it is actually moral or not. But this is about a strategy debate in which reflecting within the status quo which types of strategy or which types of action can make the status quo better at the end of the day. Never did government tell us what is currently in the status quo and what are the status quo of women's struggle and feminist movements. Is it really true that this struggle is already only stuck in basic struggles such as socio-economic issues and equal payments? And are feminist movements or movement the only agent that are pursuing that agenda, or in fact it has become the problem of the whole society that should not be burdened to only women? We say that when discrimination is also a communal cooperation and also reliant towards other people's perception, we think that people, especially women who are privileged and who have a lot of cultural influence, is actually better to be given a chance of that affirmative action, and in fact turning down the chance is actually going to dismiss a huge chance for the movement and advancement of that, of the improvement of going against the discrimination, right? Firstly, rebuttal towards the government side of the house. Look, what they are arguing is that basically these women are so privileged that they are isolated from any problems of patriarchy. We don't think that material privileges can cancel the problems of patriarchy, ladies and gentlemen, because most of the time the problem of patriarchy has no correlation whatsoever with the amount of money that you have. Domestic violence, for example, happens regardless whether you go to Harvard or whether you go to Cornell or whether you go to college at all at the end of the day. The problems of objectification that see women as a property is happening regardless whether you're actually riding a Mercedes-Benz or riding a bus at the end of the day. So at the end of the day, we don't see how material privilege actually translates to these people being less discriminated or less objectified at the end of the day. But second of all, even if they are that privileged, we think that these women are not living in the bubble, ladies and gentlemen. The fact that they're interacting with other women in their social circles, the fact that they have mothers who are probably underprivileged past times in the days and not as rich as they are right now, make them also able to sympathize and reflect under those situations, and also able to represent women who are also underprivileged because they are able to interact with other women and sympathize with other women that are close to them, ladies and gentlemen. But secondly, when the government side of the house, especially the closing government, are saying that this is going to create a bad impact towards the feminist movement simply because we're going to seem like we're always nagging and complaining even though we are already privileged, we don't think that is true. Because we want to also send a message that the problem of discrimination do not only belong to those who are poor, who are underprivileged. That the problem of domestic violence and objectification are not only happening to the poor society, but it's also happening even to the most privileged one. And within that, it's even going to create a stronger message that it's not an economic or derived from economic problem, but it is a problem of gender discrimination that is inherent inside the status quo. So in my arguments, I'm going to bring two things: exclusive contributions from the closing opposition. Two, I'm going to talk. One, I'm going to talk about the representation of issues, analyzing the status quo, and what are diverse representations that we're actually needing right now. And second of all, I'm going to talk about the cultural influence best to be represented by the privileged woman. Let's talk about firstly representation of issues. Right, we think that by government saying that currently right now, these women need to turn down the chance of affirmative action simply because they need to ensure that this affirmative action goes fully to those who are materially underprivileged, such as poor women. They haven't really justified why then this is the most important struggle currently existing inside the status quo, and why this struggle has not been advancing for centuries and decades. Because we think that the problems of basic socio-economic issues, such as unequal payment and unequal wages, are something that has been communally debated not only by the feminist agendas but also the societies in general. The problem is, the reason is simple, because money is a pragmatic issue. That husbands whose wives are working inside the garment industry, which 99% of the employers or the laborers are women, are also protesting because their women are receiving very low wages compared to those blue-collar workers that are actually men simply because they're deemed as more educated or more experienced. So because of this pragmatic push that is understandable by the whole society, such as basic socio-economic issues, in the status quo, even in the most unprivileged societies right now, even if it's not happening now, because it's so pragmatic, it will push that movement at the end of the day, that there is a communal effort or society also fighting. But the problem is going to be different with rich or privileged women, because we're talking about a privileged woman who's most likely probably do not have socio-economic issues, but they have exclusive problems who are not experienced by those who are underprivileged women. We're talking about third-wave feminism issues such as body autonomy, freedom of sexual expression, or abortion, for example, in which most of the time underprivileged women are not going to put concern of. So I think that by the idea that this woman turning down the ability for them to take affirmative action, gain achievements in political platforms, for example, or workplaces, actually dismiss their chances to advocate for more diverse or different issue that these underprivileged women do not carry at the end of the day. The problem is this issue such as third-wave feminism, like body autonomy, is exclusive only to women, whereas socio-economic issues, that is something experienced by the whole family and also by the whole community. We think that it's most important for women privileged women to never turn down the issues. But secondly, about the cultural influence of these people. Look, we think that privileged women are the ones who have higher social status, higher education, and bigger connection. At the end of the day, regardless of them being successful or not, we think them getting the chance, or like the privileged chance, to probably go inside political platforms, such as the legislative, for example, is going to create an echo chamber effect that they are going to be successful. Because they already have the initial capability to spread to people that I can make it, that I have bigger connection, then you can share it to more people, compared to them, in which most likely these are unknown people, and they have to prove themselves out until they stand out among other men, ladies and gentlemen, in which the struggles are going to be far risky and far harder. In our places, once they have taken the chances and they get the affirmative actions, it's already the achievement, and it's already an achievement that they can say to people, that they can influence people, that they can make it at the end of the day, simply because they have more cultural power through their connections and privilege. We're very proud to propose.
Thank you very much, and I invite the government whip to summarise the case for the proposition. Hear, hear.
There is going to be a difference when I'm going to be talking about this group of women compared to when my partner came up and talked about it. You saw the emotion in her eyes. You saw how that was such an important part of her life. And you as a judge can understand the level to what it relates to her life, right? So that is the idea of representation, right? So whenever you have an underprivileged woman, right, growing up and talking about this underprivileged women, you have a bigger impact than a privileged man who doesn't understand to these people, who doesn't relate to these people, whom these underprivileged people cannot relate to, will have a lesser impact. Right, exactly. So I think we have already won this debate, but just to like finish it off, right? There are basically three clashes that we're talking about, right? So I'm going to tell you that in this debate, what do these two sides of the house do for the underprivileged women, the grassroots women, right? Which side caters for it better? Secondly, I'm going to tell you, if it comes to prioritization, at a moment, at what cost, who do we prioritize? Do we prioritize the privileged or do we prioritize the underprivileged, right? And lastly, I'm going to tell you which movement is a better tool to unite these two groups of people existing in the society. Right. The first thing, right? What do you do for the underprivileged women? Tell me one significant thing, a significant contribution that this other talks that tells us about how it's going to affect the underprivileged people. This other has completely ignored the fact that that underprivileged women are a group of people who needs to be incorporated in the system, for which these quotas are very, very important. That gives these people access to education, that gives these people access to training facilities. Right. So when they say that in a privileged world, discrimination still exists, right? We tell you what kind of discrimination exists. Discrimination exists when you don't get a promotion or when you can't do a PhD, right? But for these women, the discrimination is much more. The discrimination is in terms of rape, is in terms of the fact that after 18 that they cannot even get to school because they are married off, right, in India. And we tell you that is a problem. And even if we buy into their scenario where they tell you that even this group of people get married and get assaulted and raped and have domestic violence, the privileged people, we tell you that it's far more worse for this underprivileged people, right? Where you hear stories about women in India getting gang raped in a bus. We tell you it's even more severe for this group of people in whatever instances that you want to talk about. All right, sit down. So when they talk about the fact that where was I? Okay, fine. They tell you that better chances to the privileged. We tell you that the idea of quota was firstly instigated in the system to make sure that you cater to the grassroots people of the world, for which you don't have access to. So the principle of having quotas or having this privileges is to, at the end of the day, reach to the mass group of people who lie at the underneath of the pile, right? And then move on to the privilege. So under the scenario of priority, this group of people always comes in first, right? And we tell you that how it affects both this under our policy, how it affects both the privileged, underprivileged, and the state itself, right? But before we move on, yes, your point.
All the issues you were talking about, like rape, like a lack of basic education, are issues that are not solved by affirmative action. We're completely with you. Solve these problems. But why is it necessary for privileged women to step back in order to achieve these policies?
Exactly. So that is the point I was getting to, right? The idea of privileged women, right? So what do we really mean by privileged women? That is what my partner comes up and tell you that these people get benefits initially, right? But they're given a birth lottery. So they have a better chance of making it out of the first place, right? Compared to this group, because these are people at the worst ends of the pyramid, right? And this is why they, in some senses, get priorities. I will tell you that we do things for the privileged, right? For example, like whenever a privileged woman, right, buys into the narrative and gets affirmative action for something that she doesn't need because she has gone through a proper business school, because she has already gone into access, she becomes weak at the first place, right? Where she doesn't come up with a strong personality because she uses something that she doesn't really require at the first place. So they come off smaller, right? And secondly, we'll tell you that these women take these positions for granted, right? Because these people did not have to go through issues where they did not have food in their bellies, right? Whereas those women who do not have access to that, so they care less, right? So they work less, right? They work less hard enough than those group of people, and they don't empathize with that movement that this group of people relate to, right? So at the end of the day, what you get is this group of people. When you let go of that quota, you opt into those disadvantaged women. So when this women, privileged women, at the end of the day decides, you know what, that I'm not going to take this quota and I'm going to leave it for someone underprivileged. You see, they opt into a system where they empathize with these people, where they understand, that these people are very, very important to society as well, and I'm going to let my position go because these people needs it more, and that it creates a better world, right? Then it creates this group of people to come ahead and create change. And we told you how it affects the underprivileged people, right? Because these are the people who cannot get out of the vicious cycle at the first place, where they cannot go out of the boundaries that are set in the first place. And why it is so important to care to these people, give them those facilities and give those avenues to create change. Because whenever you create those avenues, you create representation, right? You create leaders in those small communities, right? Who can lead this group of people, who can lead those changes, right? And who can represent this group of people at the first place, right? And why it is so much potential, right? Where you do not completely ignore this group of people, but at the same time you give these people, you realize that these people have potential and you care to this thing. And tell you, For the feminist movement to go forward, I think it's important that the state and the organization and the stakeholder gets benefited as well. Because when you cater for only privileged women, you see feminism movement does not go ahead in a speed that we want to, right? It only goes in a very small extent because the people that needs to be benefited, the people at the grassroots, do not ever get access to those things. So whenever you do this, as a state you get benefited because the feminist movement moves forward, right? Where you have inclusion for every group of people. And that is why we believe it is so important. So the debate was about underprivileged women, right? Who needed to be talked about, right? And how you give them access, because certain privileged women who do not need this access get those benefits. And we dealt with that. This side of the house did not deal with that. We talked about prioritization, right? Why you prioritize this group of people? Because these are people who have been in the vicious cycle for such a long time, right? Who have been left over, who do not have access to even cell phones, right? We tell you that even material privilege is not a big deal. We tell you it is a big deal when you have a phone call, right? And you can inform someone of a domestic violence, right? These people do not have those things. We tell you that this education is important, right? And at the same time, we tell you that how it unites two fragments of the revolution, right? And how this group of people empathize with the underprivileged and the women movement goes forward. For all those reasons, we're proud.
I'd like to thank that speaker for their speech. I'd like to invite the opposition whip to conclude the debate as a whole. Hear, hear.
Look, we do not debate in fight guns, because in our side of the house, even though we're going to include privileged women inside feminist movements, we do not say that there will be no underprivileged women at all in the feminist movement. We say that to a certain extent, there will be a lot of underprivileged women, even though there is not a lot of them. We think that a handful of underprivileged women is already enough for them to represent underprivileged women. However, what being said by the closing opposition is that we need to understand in the progress of current status quo, when we are no longer talking about we do not no longer talking about women's suffrage, we do no longer talking about workforce inequality, but currently we are talking about third wave feminism. We are talking something that is more essential to all women. We're talking about body autonomy, we're talking about right to abortion, right to children custody, some things that it can only be represented by the women who are coming from privileged community. We say that in our side of the house, when we're going to include these underprivileged women and privileged women, we think that the discussions will be more diverse, because the discussion will be not skewed into only discussions that the reason why women be discriminated is because of their socio-economic status, it's because they are poor, it's because they do not have enough education. We think that we should have left that kind of discussions decades ago. We think that these are not kind of feminist movement that we want to adhere to. We think that currently feminist movements should progress, and we will not agree with this status quo. No thanks. But first of all, I'm going to talk about two things in my speech. I'm going to talk about whether or not their proposals will be good or bad for feminist movements. We say that the proposal will be bad because you're reducing the message of feminist struggles into socio-economic status, into socio-economic struggle instead of the struggles of general women. Second of all, I'm going to also talk about whether or not the discussion is good for the progress of third wave feminisms, feminists that being taught inside closing governments and the whole government and the current feminist movement that we want to achieve in the current status quo. No thanks. Now, first, let's talk about the message. They say that the currently women that need these proposals so much are women who coming from underprivileged community, because these are women who does not get the benefit before. First, what I'm trying to say is that the socio-economic problems, such as equal payment, such as inequality treatment in workplace, are already being taught inside society, because these are structural problems. These are not a problems of individual and women per se, but these are problems that are being suffered through a lot of society. So we think that even without these women trying to represent themselves, they already have a proxy inside society that talk for them. And even We also think that these privileged women could also become proxy for them because they could also feel empathy, especially in our side of the house. When we are going to create a rhetoric that, look, you are taking away the place of the women who are underprivileged. Now you also have the moral responsibility to talk on behalf of them and to represent them. We think that that kind of rhetorics are even stronger inside our side of school, and we can incorporate more privileged women to talk for the underprivileged women. And we say that the echo chamber will even bigger because these women already have influence to begin with, they already have network to begin with, and they, to a certain extent, they might come in from established family who own media or have an access to politics. We say that you're going to cut short the time for them to make a progress. While in their side of the house, we agree that these women, underprivileged women, might also have the capacity to become a proxies of feminists. However, we think that the process, it's gonna be longer because at first, they need to prove themselves first, they need to build their own networks, and that is only by that time they only can be able to speak for the feminist movement. But even that happens, they're only going to speak for the issues that only personal for them, issues of education, issues of socio-economic issues that they felt before. They are unable to speak for the issues that being suffered by the other parts of women, namely issues about sexuality, namely issues about body autonomy. And we think that if you have privileged women who does not suffer from socioeconomic depressions and socioeconomic struggle, we think that you're able to progress the discussion and able to elevate the discussions by saying that, look, even though I'm not underprivileged women, but I also suffer from patriarchy. The fact that I could not get the child custody after my divorce, or I could not get enough alimony, showing that the issues of unfairness towards women inside marriage is not only the issues of underprivileged women, but it's also issues of privileged women. We think that it's going to bring more closures and to bring more portrayals towards patriarchy towards women rather than in their side of the house. Yes.
Where do you think it's worst, for the underprivileged or the privileged?
We think. Well, no. When we talk about feminist issue, we do not talk about numbers of women that we're going to save, but we talk about how, in the long run, we're going to create an echo chamber and going to create a long-term effect. We think that in their side of the house, they might be able to help handfuls of underprivileged women. But the question is that how these women are going to resonate and create echo chambers in the futures. We think that if you talk about capacity, we think that privileged women who already have an established network and who already have all of the materials benefit and all of the non-material benefit for them to speak are able better to represent women to be better. But second of all, we also want to talk about discussions currently inside society. We think that we already left the discussions of first wave feminism and second wave feminisms. Now we're currently moving to the third wave feminisms. We think that the reason why currently third wave feminisms cannot progress so far is because we are still stuck in the second wave feminism, where we'll talk about economic issues and we will still talk about issues of education and equality. We think that in that particular debate, the debate and the discourse only revolve around socio-economic debate and something that could not be solved by the women instead. We think that currently we want to talk about something that is much more progressive. We want to talk about issues whether or not women are able to break down from the patriarchal chain, like not to wear hijab, like for example in Middle Eastern part or in Middle Eastern part. We think that that can only progress if you're able to incorporate these privileged women who are not associated at all with socioeconomic status, and they're able to talk on behalf of themselves. That's going to be better. So what have been brought by the closing opposition inside this debate is two. We said that the socioeconomic issues already have proxy, society as a proxy. Second of all, we think that these women does not need to be able to represent themselves. They can be represented by privileged women with the rhetorics that these women have sacrificed their future for you. But third of all, we think that in order to create echo chambers, these women does not need to use emotion. They can still use their material benefit, they can still use the connections in order to create a better echo chamber and sustainable effect. But last but not least, we think that we need to progress the current stagnant discussions that only revolve on socioeconomic status, and we want to make issues of feminism become issues of women in general and not only issues on several women. We're back to